111th Congress ended with that old college try. Members of Congress and college students usually end their terms by cramming all their work into the last couple of weeks. Ratifying the START Treaty, confirming judges, passing the Food Safety and 9/11 First Responders bills, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, all after reaching a huge tax cut compromise deal that also extended unemployment benefits. Some are calling it the most productive Congress since the 1960s Great Society, comparable even to the 1930s New Deal Congress. So why are others calling it one of the most politically dysfunctional Congresses ever, in need of rules changes to reduce obstruction? Perhaps it has something to do with this graph. It shows the dramatic rise in procedural blocks in the Senate in recent years, how a procedure that was once meant for extreme circumstances is now used casually to clog the entire system. When the 112th Congress takes over on January 5th, will filibuster reform be the next big fight on the Hill? Joining me now are Norm Ornstein, congressional scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Ezra Klein, columnist for The Washington Post. Ezra, to start with you, that graph is yours on what's happened in terms of clogging up the system with cloture motions. I don't like to call them filibusters because technically they aren't filibusters, but I might slip into the casual usage of it here. And that does bring up the question of filibuster reform as a first-day order of business coming up. But help me here. I am having trouble thinking that we've just seen a hugely productive Congress and a hugely productive Senate, and that we therefore must change the rules of the Senate because the Senate isn't getting enough done. Can I hold both of those thoughts at the same time?
I think you can, although I'd rephrase the latter. It's not that they're not getting enough done, arguably. The way to look at it is that it's been a very, very productive Congress, but it's been a productive Congress because you saw majorities you have not seen in Congress since 1975. So this was a moment when every force was aligned for action. It was as good as it gets for legislating, and they did quite a bit with it. But so you got to look forward, too, and you got to ask yourself, okay, coming up, are the dangers to the country that Congress will do too much or too little? And the way I'd put it is this. All the things we should worry about are on autopilot. Healthcare costs, we do nothing, we go bankrupt. Carbon in the atmosphere, we do nothing, the earth heats. Infrastructure, if we do nothing, it crumbles. So the harder you make it to do things in normal times, not these sort of generationally odd moments when you get 60 Democrats for the first time since 75, but normal everyday sessions, the less likely it is we will take action on any of those pretty important fights. And if we don't, then the consequences will be terrific. So I go back to that graph you showed. I don't think that shows a functional body, and the fact that they're able to get things done at a moment of true sort of a moment where they had an enormous number of votes does not mean they'll be able to get it done next time when we need them to.
Norm Ornstein, no one has a fuller historical perspective of these things than you do. How does this Congress compare to these Congresses going back historically to the 60s? And then do we need a rule change to have a more productive Congress, given that the rules that they were operating under in the 60s when they were so productive were even more difficult in some ways than these rules?
Yeah, and of course, in some ways, Lawrence, let me say, the problem is not the rules per se. We've operated under these rules, and it hasn't been so bad. It's the way the culture has changed and been debased, and it's the way the minority exploited the rules and used them in ways that it was never intended. It would be nice to change the culture. That's much harder. You've got to change the rules first and hope that the culture will follow, or at least break the back of some of the worst dysfunctional elements of it. But with all of that, and I actually wrote a piece a year ago saying that we were on track to having the most productive Congress since the New Deal, even without START. This was before health care passed, but expecting that it would, and that there would be Wall Street reform. And a part of it was that even in the stimulus package that passed, and you began to parse it out into the individual pieces, it was extraordinary legislative accomplishment. If you move beyond even the big three, the stimulus, the health care, the Wall Street reform, into some of the smaller things, we had a huge change in the social fabric from credit card reform to the biggest public lands management bill that we've seen in a couple of decades, to enormous changes in energy and the environment, and then some of the things done in the lame duck. But even before we got to the lame duck, it was damned impressive. It just happened to happen under the most dysfunctional political environment that I've seen in 41 years of watching this up close.
Ezra Klein, there is a move among the Democrats to change the so-called filibuster rule in the Senate. And there's a theory that it can be done on day one, and only on day one, with just 51 votes, that they won't need the mythical 60 to get it done. Tom Harkin's been involved. Chuck Schumer's been involved. What is it that they think they want to change, and exactly what kind of change is it that they're thinking of trying to introduce that day?
Well, they're less sure about that second part. So what we're talking about is a constitutional option. It's really being pushed by Tom Udall of New Mexico. And his argument is that in the Constitution, it says each body will be able to determine its own rules. And so at the beginning of each new Congress, they essentially have to vote, or at least to accept the new rules. And at that point, before Rule 22, which is where the filibuster lives, comes into effect, it's a 51-person vote. It's a simple majority. So if you could make a change right then you can simply change the rules. You don't need the 67 votes you would need for an official rule change. I should say, and Norm can speak to this, that there are other ways you could do it mid-session with 51 votes, according to many scholars of these rules, but they're more complicated and, more to the point, seem more controversial. The question of what they want to do is more difficult. As of yet, they really don't know. They want to give Harry Reid leverage in negotiating with Mitch McConnell for the filibuster for next session. Senator Jeff Merkley has, I think, a very smart filibuster reform package out, which would make what you were saying that you don't want to call it a filibuster. It would make what we now do look more like a filibuster. It would force people who want a filibuster to actually be on the floor, to be talking, have 20 of the minority on the floor at once, to never stop debating the motion. You wouldn't be able to filibuster motions to debate because that's just stopping people from debating. So it'd make the filibuster a lot more like what we saw in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But there's no real sense yet whether that particular package of changes has anything near unanimity in the Democratic caucus.
Norm, one of the things they're thinking about is dropping that 60-vote threshold to maybe a 55-vote threshold. I can tell you, when I worked in the Senate, we had 57 Democrats. I hated the 60-vote threshold. As soon as we became the minority, and I was still there, I loved the 60-vote threshold because we were able to get in the way of things. Isn't that one of the dynamics here, that as soon as one party becomes the minority, they suddenly love this rule that they used to hate?
Oh, absolutely. And, of course, that's one of the things that Chris Dodd, among others, has been warning the younger members against. I would tell you, though, Lawrence, they're not going to change the threshold from 60. I've been talking to and working with a lot of the younger members, including a lot of the younger Democrats, Mark Udall, Tom Udall, Jeff Merkley, and a whole series of others, Amy Klobuchar, who's been one of the foremost figures in this as well, and some of the more senior ones. And the idea here is to cut out the underbrush. The problem, you mentioned, it's cloture motions. Some of those cloture motions, to be fair, were filed by the majority and filling the amendment tree to try and cut off a potential filibuster, and the Republicans didn't like that very much. But a lot of it was a deliberate attempt to use all the rules, including the fact that it takes 2 days once you have filed a cloture motion to actually get a vote on that cloture motion, that you can have several bites at the apple, a motion to proceed, the bill itself. You can do it on amendments. The idea that after that there are 30 hours of presumed post-cloture debate. Republicans used the 30 hours without even debating, and they, of course, filed these or attempted these filibusters, or said they were going to filibuster even on unanimous or near unanimous bills and nominations. So if you can cut out a lot of that stuff and make sure that the rules use just for obstruction goes away, and there's a price to be paid by a minority. If you feel intensely about an issue of great national significance, you got to be there and you got to debate continuously. There are ways of doing that, and that's, I think, what we're talking about here.
Well, I, for one, am hoping for a big, dramatic showdown on Senate rules on their first day back to be covered here on The Last Word. Norm Ornstein and Ezra Klein,
what could be better for ratings?
Thank you both for your scholarship tonight.